The Hall of Power was not designed for silence. Yet on that morning, silence ruled. The chandeliers above the Grand Conference Room in New York flickered with a golden glow. But even their brilliance could not distract from the tension that pressed down like a storm cloud. Delegates, advisors, and dignitaries sat rigidly, their pens idle, their phones untouched. For once, even the hum of whispered conversations was absent. Everyone was waiting. At the center of this silence stood a man who was not supposed to belong there. A man who carried neither the polished aura of Wall Street nor the aristocratic posture of Washington's dynasties. He wore a suit, yes, but it fit him like armor rather than costume. His very presence unsettled the order of the room. That man was Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, who in recent months had become a symbol of defiance, not only against French colonial remnants but against the larger machinery of Western dominance. And across from him, seated with the practiced confidence of someone who believed the world itself was an extension of his personality, was Donald J. Trump, former President of the United States, architect of chaos and spectacle, and perhaps the only man in modern politics who thrived in disorder as though it were oxygen. The clash between them had not yet begun, but everyone in the room knew this was not going to be a debate. It was going to be a reckoning. Trump leaned back in his chair, his signature red tie cascading like a banner of defiance against the polished oak table. He smirked as if the entire gathering had been orchestrated for his entertainment. His fingers drummed casually on the wood, each tap sounding like a countdown to provocation. So, Trump finally broke the silence, his voice booming in a way that demanded attention rather than requested it. We have a young man here who thinks he can lecture the world. A young general, very tough, I've heard. But let me tell you something, the world doesn't run on speeches. It runs on deals. And nobody knows deals better than me. Believe me. Laughter rippled from a few corners of the room, half-hearted, nervous, sycophantic. But Traoré did not flinch. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, fixed on Trump with the quiet intensity of a soldier who had stared down far greater dangers than words. When Traoré spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, heavy with the weight of a continent's unspoken grievances. Mr. Trump, he began, the world has been running on your deals for decades. Deals that strip Africa of its wealth. Deals that turn nations into clients. Deals that sell sovereignty for promises that never arrive. If this is your art, then the canvas is stained with blood. The words dropped like iron. No one laughed now. Trump leaned forward, his smirk fading into a look of amused challenge. Blood. Let me tell you about blood, General. When America builds, it saves lives. When America leads, the world is safer. I brought peace, big peace, historic peace, to the Middle East. Nobody thought it could be done. But I did it. And you, what do you bring? Protests? Revolutions in dusty streets? You're playing with matches in a world soaked with gasoline. Traoré's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the measured tone of someone who knew his words were being carved into memory. When your nation builds, it builds on the bones of others. And when it speaks of peace, it speaks of silence, the silence of those who are forced to obey. Africa is not gasoline, Mr. Trump. Africa is fire. A fire that has burned for centuries, smothered by empires, but never extinguished. And now it burns again, not for destruction, but for freedom. The room stirred. Diplomats shifted in their seats, torn between admiration and fear. The confrontation was escalating, and everyone could sense it was no longer about Burkina Faso or even Africa. It was about the very narrative of global order. Trump pointed a finger at Traoré, his voice rising with that familiar blend of bravado and indignation that had electrified rallies across America. Freedom. Don't lecture me about freedom. I gave my people freedom. I brought jobs. I brought pride. I put America first, and everybody hated me for it. Because when America is strong, the globalists lose. And guess what? They hated you too. You think you're fighting me? You're fighting the same people I fought, the elites, the bureaucrats, the fake news, the people who want the world run by unelected cowards. That's the real enemy, General. Not me. For the first time, The young African leader's eyes flickered with something other than defiance. It was recognition. Trump was cunning, in his own chaotic way. He was reframing the battlefield, twisting the argument to make himself the victim of the same machinery Traoré despised. But Traoré was not so easily cornered. He leaned forward, his voice sharper now, each word edged with steel. You fought them to take their place. I fight them to destroy their throne. That is the difference between us. The first clash had drawn blood, not from the body, but from the image each man sought to project. The world outside the room was waiting, watching through the eyes of cameras, waiting to see which of these two figures would emerge as the champion of rebellion, and which would be branded as its pretender. And as the session continued, it became clear this was only the beginning. The corridors of Washington buzzed like a disturbed beehive. What had started as a distant challenge from West Africa was now knocking directly at America's front door. Traoré's speeches, sharp, unapologetic, drenched in historical memory, were no longer ignored. They were circulating in every newsroom, whispered in every embassy, dissected in every boardroom. And above all, they had reached the ears of Donald J. Trump, who, despite his bravado, understood the danger of a narrative he could not control. Trump leaned back in his leather chair inside Mar-a-Lago, staring at the flickering television screen. News anchors replayed Traoré's words, "Africa will no longer bow to empires of debt." The phrase had gone viral. Across social media, young Africans hailed him as a liberator, while American commentators debated whether this obscure leader had the audacity to undermine the global order, or the genius to actually shift it. "Get me the generals," Trump barked suddenly. His aides froze, uncertain if he meant the Pentagon or the inner circle of political loyalists. He often called "my generals." It didn't matter. They obeyed. Within hours, a confidential meeting convened, blending national security staff, Wall Street lobbyists, and media strategists. Trump's message was clear. Traoré was not simply an African problem. He was a narrative threat, and narratives, in the 21st century, could be more dangerous than missiles. Across the Atlantic, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's palace was lit deep into the night. Maps of Africa sprawled across a wooden table, dotted with pins marking allies, sympathizers, and undecided nations. He knew Washington would not stay passive. He knew Trump's instinct was to dominate, not negotiate. Yet he also understood something Trump did not: the silent hunger of nations long silenced. Around him sat a small circle of African advisors, diplomats, and thinkers. Some wore suits, others traditional garments, but all shared the same fire in their eyes. They had watched decades of exploitation masked as partnership, loans disguised as aid, and bases disguised as protection. Now, for the first time, they felt the axis tilting. "Trump will move fast," one advisor warned. "Then we move faster," Traoré replied, his voice steady. "We will not fight him in his towers. We will fight him in the conscience of the world." The strategy was bold: flood international forums, mobilize African youth online, expose decades of American double standards, and forge new alliances with nations tired of Washington's dominance. Soon, the clash escalated. At the United Nations, American diplomats tried to dismiss Traoré as a populist demagogue. Yet one by one, African representatives rose, quoting him, echoing him, even defending him. For the first time in years, the balance of applause in the UN General Assembly leaned not toward Washington but toward Ouagadougou. Trump was livid. Cameras captured him storming out of a briefing, muttering about ungrateful nations. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on African governments through sanctions, aid suspensions, and subtle threats. But Traoré had prepared for this. He had built a network not of dependency, but of solidarity. Food convoys from neighboring states crossed borders in defiance of American disapproval. Community radios broadcast his words in dozens of languages. Then came the shockwave. In an unprecedented move, Traoré called for a Pan-African energy bloc, an alliance to renegotiate all oil, gas, and mineral contracts with Western companies. Overnight, Wall Street panicked. Stock tickers turned red. Analysts warned of systemic risk to global supply chains. Trump, who prided himself on market strength, felt the tremor reach his own base of support. But he was not one to retreat. From the Oval Office, he delivered a thunderous speech. America will not be lectured by corrupt politicians in failed states. We built this world order, and we will defend it. The words echoed, powerful yet brittle. For every American cheer, there was an African roar of defiance. And so, the second chapter of this confrontation was set, a battle not of armies, but of legitimacy. Washington deployed pressure, sanctions, and narratives. Traoré countered with history, unity, and vision. The world watched, sensing that the struggle between a billionaire ex-president and a young African revolutionary was not a sideshow, but a mirror of the century to come. The autumn wind that swept across New York carried more than the usual chill. It carried tension, expectation, and the echoes of an unfolding struggle that was no longer confined to quiet backrooms or whispered strategies. The confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump had moved beyond shadows and now demanded a stage large enough to bear its weight. The stage would be nothing less than the United Nations headquarters, its towering glass facade reflecting the fractured world it was supposed to unite. Inside the Grand Assembly Hall, diplomats sat rigidly in their seats. Flags of nearly 200 nations lined the chamber, each cloth silently flapping from the invisible winds of history. The seats filled quickly, not just by ambassadors but by cameras, journalists, and the watchful eyes of intelligence operatives. Everyone understood that today's session was not an ordinary debate on resolutions or funding. It was an arena. Two men, two visions, and two futures were about to collide. Donald Trump entered first. Despite no longer holding office, his presence was engineered with theatrical precision. He moved slowly, chin raised, his signature red tie cutting through the dark of his tailored suit. The hall erupted in scattered applause, mixed with groans of disapproval. But Trump absorbed both as though they were fuel. He smiled, waved, and leaned toward microphones he had no business touching, whispering jokes to his entourage. For Trump, the world remained a reality show, and every glare of the spotlight was his by right. Then came Traoré. He did not enter through the grand door but through a side corridor, escorted not by bodyguards in expensive suits but by a line of young African officers in plain uniforms. They wore no medals, only conviction in their eyes. The room fell quiet, as though air itself paused to measure this man's steps. He was younger than most expected, his military cap tucked under his arm, his gait carrying both humility and defiance. Traoré's presence was not engineered. It was earned. The two men's eyes met across the chamber, and for the first time, silence did not belong to the diplomats. It belonged to them. The Secretary-General cleared his throat, announcing the agenda. But everyone knew the agenda was a farce. This session was about one thing: who would dominate the narrative of the 21st century? An empire built on spectacle and money, or a rebellion rooted in dignity and sovereignty? Trump was the first to speak. He stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone with the impatience of a man convinced he was being wronged, and launched into his signature cadence. They told me Africa was finished. They told me it was a disaster, folks. But then you have this man here, this little guy, telling us that he's going to change the world. He says he's going to stand up to America, to the West. Believe me, it's not going to happen. We've built everything. We've paid for everything. And without us, without me, there is no world order. Period. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded, others whispered. Cameras zoomed in, catching the beads of sweat forming on the brows of envoys who feared being caught applauding or resisting. Trump smirked, letting the weight of his words settle. He turned to face Traoré directly. You can wear your little uniform, you can make your little speeches. But remember this: power is not about dreams. It's about deals. And I make the best deals. The chamber buzzed with a mixture of laughter and gasps. Then, slowly, deliberately, Traoré rose from his seat. He did not rush to the podium. He walked with the same deliberate calm with which one approaches a battlefield. When he stood behind the microphone, he did not adjust it. He did not clear his throat. He simply began to speak. You speak of deals, Traoré said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the hall. But deals made in smoke-filled rooms. behind the backs of the people, are not power. They are chains. Chains that bind the poor to poverty. Chains that tie nations to debts they did not create. Chains that make us believe slavery ended when in truth, it was only repainted. The room stiffened. Traoré's French-accented English carried no hesitation, only weight. He continued, "You call me little man. But I carry the voices of millions who have no seat in this chamber, who never appear on your television screens, who build your skyscrapers, mine your minerals, feed your corporations, and yet live and die invisible. If that is small, then yes, I am small. But I would rather be small with them than large and empty as your empire has become." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some African delegates stood in silent applause. A few Latin American representatives joined, followed by whispers from Asian envoys. Trump leaned back in his chair, his grin tightening into a scowl. But Traoré was not finished. "You say the world belongs to those who pay for it. But the truth is simple. The world belongs to those who bleed for it. And Africa has bled enough. From our gold to our diamonds, from our oil to our children's futures, you have taken, and called it order. Today, that order is questioned. Not by me alone, but by the tide of history. And history does not bargain. It overturns." Silence fell again, deeper this time, heavier. The cameras flashed but dared not interrupt. For the first time, the confrontation was no longer entertainment. It was revelation. Trump stood abruptly, breaking the spell. His voice cracked with irritation. "This is fake news. All of it. I've given Africa more than anyone. Charity, investments, jobs. You should be thanking me. Without America, you wouldn't even be here." Traoré turned his gaze on him, steady, unflinching. "I am here despite America," he said. The hall erupted. Applause thundered, not universal, but undeniable. For every clap, there was a grim face. For every cheer, a clenched jaw. But it was enough. The confrontation was no longer a question of who spoke louder. It was about who spoke truth. Outside, the world watched the clash live. In African villages, old radios crackled with Traoré's words. In Wall Street offices, traders paused as the market trembled from the weight of political uncertainty. In Pentagon war rooms, analysts scribbled furiously, asking whether this young captain had just redefined global power with nothing more than words. And in the streets of Ouagadougou, children repeated his lines as though they were proverbs. Trump stormed out of the chamber, muttering insults, surrounded by aides trying to control the damage. Traoré remained, shaking hands with leaders who had once dismissed him but now leaned in, hungry to be seen with the man who had stood unshaken before America's roar. The confrontation was over, but the war was only beginning.